now I'm going to introduce Lisa Mazuka, who is, wow, she owns her business on Mark Graphics. She's a Barnegat Bay volunteer master naturalist. She is active in the Native Plant Society of New Jersey, so she's very plugged into all of this. She's done some really interesting things in her own yard. We did a project. We gave a grant to the Ocean County Soil Conservation District, who selected 10 homeowners to go through a series of workshops and then install a Jersey-friendly yard at their own home. So Lisa was one of those 10 people, and she did really cool things, which she'll tell you about.
Absolutely.
And in addition to that, she also manages the gardens at Jake's Branch County Park, which are demonstration native plant gardens done through the SHIP project, which I'm sure you'll talk about. So she's taken that on as a volunteer to redo them, replant them, and they're looking really good. So.
Okay, so those are my folks. I wasn't always a gardener, and though I was born and bred in Ocean County, New Jersey, my folks came from Jersey City. So as a young couple, they moved down to Ocean County, and they worked hard, and gardening was not on their radar. They came from impermeable surfaces. But I got married in my 20s, and my father-in-law is a different story. He's from Italy, and he grew up on a farm and raised goats and grew things always. And so when he came to Brick and settled in Brick, he always had a vegetable garden in the backyard, and he planted fruit trees in his backyard. And that was my first experience with in-home gardening. And it was not only annual vegetables that you had to continuously input and amend the soil to get production each year, but it was also these gorgeous fruit trees that you plant once, and production only got better and better and better, and didn't take much maintenance over the long term. So it got my wheels turning, and I wanted to start growing food too. So my first vegetable garden was in Beechwood, New Jersey, in my home in 2007. We bought there, and I didn't start gardening until 2009. It took me a little while to get going. But my first beds were double dug and amended with compost that I was just starting a compost pile. I had no idea what I was doing. Nothing was ever really broken down all that well. But I was learning, and I was reading, and I was finding out more and more about how to integrate perennials into growing food. Growing food, I felt and do feel, is a huge responsibility. And I feel like it's a way to become resilient and secure as an individual and as a family. So I wanted to bring that into my life and into my garden. And I didn't stop. After my first garden bed, I caught the bug, and I loved it. And so I made many garden beds in my backyard, and I grew all different kinds of vegetables. I grew all different kinds of fruits. Anything that would really survive in our planting zone, I was willing to try. And some things that wouldn't survive in our planting zone, but I tried them anyway. They didn't make it, but I tried. At that point, I didn't know much about native plants. I didn't care to know much about native plants. I was growing food. And so I didn't even know what food was native and what food wasn't native. It didn't enter into my conversation yet. But I wanted to expand even more than this. And the best sun in my yard was in the front yard. And so I started learning about edible landscaping because I wanted to take advantage of that space. And as I grew, this is my front yard. I started reducing the size of my crappy lawn and claiming it as garden beds where I could plant shrubs that the neighbors wouldn't realize were actually giving me a yield. That introduced me to permaculture. And permaculture, I connected with that so well, especially when I learned about Back to Eden gardening and Ruth Stout's no-work gardening method. Who wouldn't love that, right? So it worked out because with permaculture, it it made sense to me. You're mimicking nature. You're observing and finding patterns and mimicking nature, because in natural systems, like the forest, like the marsh, like nobody's going in and irrigating these places or fertilizing these places. So I knew that with these principles, I wouldn't have to bring in chemical inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, which even at that point I knew was something that I didn't want to do. So it's a method of decision making, and it's you try and become a producer instead of a consumer, and you find ways to integrate systems and reduce waste and chemical inputs. So I reduced my lawn, and in doing that, I learned to sheet mulch. And sheet mulching is a great way to reduce the size of the lawn. No more double digging those garden beds. Now you take cardboard and you lay it over turf grass, and then you put straw and compost and wood chips and organic matter, seaweed from the not seaweed, eelgrass. So you can put that on top. Whatever you have access to that's organic material, you can use in your sheet mulching layers. And it does a number of things. It feeds the soil microbes, and it retains moisture, and it keeps the weeds down so that you spend less time working in your garden and more time enjoying it. So that was my garden at Beechwood. On the other side of the property, I chose to put in a keyhole garden, which is a beautiful tool that you can use that comes from permaculture. It's really when you have very poor soil on the ground. Folks, permaculturists went to Africa to help underprivileged people who have very poor soil and very little rainfall. It helps to make a great raised garden bed. You have a compost basket in the center. You put your compostable materials in the center of the garden and water there. If water is scarce, you want to use it wisely. So if you water that compost basket in the center, the nutrients leaches out into the garden bed and feeds the garden. It's a fantastic way to reduce human input into the garden as far as energy, wasted energy. It's all happening in the right space. So that is in the front yard in that other garden at my first property. This is an herb spiral using found and recycled materials, and it creates a variety of microclimates for high, dry herbs. It creates shade. There's a sunnier side. As you go down the spiral, you'll have more moisture towards the bottom of the spiral. So that's a tool to be used in the garden. And these are apple trees all around it. I grew things from seed and from cuttings and propagating plants, cloning. Prickly pear cactus, you really just have to snap off a paddle and toss it, and then there it grows again. So I did a lot of research and expanded my gardens and learned how to compost. I was fascinated by the way all these leaves that everyone bags up and has the town take away can become an invaluable soil amendment. And I started learning about microbes and the soil food web, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. All of these things make up a healthy soil. And in 1 teaspoon of soil, there are more microbes than humans on the planet. So that is what creates a functioning soil that can help us clean water and reduce the toxic pollution from stormwater runoff. Let's see what else. So as these things started developing and growing, I started getting production from this yard. There's an elderberry here and a fruit tree, and I planted some Jerusalem artichokes. Without my knowledge, I started planting native edibles because that's what grows in this zone. So some of it was going to be native. there's a beach plum here and annuals tucked in between the perennials. As you plant perennials, you have to think about what their mature size will be. So you space them accordingly. That tree might be 2 feet tall now, but it'll have a 15-foot spread. So I have to leave some room in between. Things look very empty in the beginning when you're just planting perennials. So you put annuals in between, be it ornamental flowers or productive vegetables, and then as the perennials come to mature size, you reduce the annuals that are filling in those spaces. These are all that beechwood property. And then in 2015, I moved. And we started over in new construction in Bayville, not too far away. But this yard was very different. I had spent years developing the soil in that other yard, and I didn't know how good I had it by the time I left. Here, I had a sandbox, not a single worm.
Yeah.
And that was tricky. So I started slow, but I also had a slope, which I never had to deal with before. So these beds were kind of islands on this big empty space, and I decided I needed to terrace them. And by terracing these beds, I put, in doing that, I put logs on the downhill side, and I sheet mulched up to fill in that space and slow the water as it ran down the hill. So that's the beginning, and that's in development. I moved in 2015. This is what the front yard looks like now. So you can see that as I'm filling in with plants, and then we back up, that's my meadow strip. Along the road, because I live on a slope and I don't have the entire front yard planted with terrace beds, maybe someday I will. It's slow going, you plant as you go. I still had runoff coming down the front yard. This acts as a riparian zone, and a riparian zone is really a buffer. They call it a diaper, and they end up making a zone with perennial and deep-rooted plants between agricultural land and waterways. And that's to protect the waterways from agricultural runoff and toxic chemicals. I did that on my yard because for the most part, in a storm event, that street going across my front, that's a waterway. It's going to a waterway. So I have to protect it. And to do that, I planted a meadow strip. Now it's kind of hard to see, but this meadow strip is only 6 or 8 feet from the road. Behind that is neatly mowed. And then I have my rustic looking garden beds behind that. But it's not obtrusive to the neighbors, at least my neighbors. and they actually have commented that they really enjoyed the flowers this summer. This was the first summer that it really filled in, and I got poppies in here, and I planted a wildflower mix. And that, oh, those are beautiful, what are those? So you can get your neighbors to come on board, especially if you share blueberries and strawberries and elderberry syrup and things that you make from what you grew up in. So that's another view of the gardens. And some of the things that I have planted here are beach plums. I have 3 beach plums and high bush cranberry and an elderberry back there. This is a bonfire peach tree. It's got beautiful flowers and red foliage all season long. There's prickly pear down here. I have over 80 different varieties of fruits and vegetables. So I just keep adding to it, and diversity is so important when it comes to soil health that I don't feel the need to plant huge swaths of the same thing. Nature doesn't like a monoculture. There's no prairie that will only be planted with one variety of anything. So by nature. Here's another shot, and this is all in the front yard. There are pawpaws, Here and here, there's Jerusalem artichokes back there. It's kind of in the beginning of the season, so they're short. But you can see that I planted them next to a fence because Jerusalem artichokes get to be about 12 feet tall. And if you don't really understand how tall 12 feet tall is, you don't want to plant them up by the mailbox in the front because that blocks everything else and looks very weedy. So I made a lot of mistakes at the Beechwood property, and I fixed them when I came to Bayville. I also have 5 blueberries planted here, a yastaberry, that's a rhubarb. There's lingonberries and blood dock sorrel and cranberries in this bed. There's Egyptian walking onions, currants, and a gooseberry, and there's plenty of things that can fit in a very small space. In a forest garden, they call them food forests when you plan for a productive forest garden that will produce food. And in a forest, there are many layers that you would use, that are used. There's the canopy layer, and then the understory, and then shrubbery, and then the herbaceous layer, and then vines, and root vegetables, and fungi, so mushrooms too. That's something that I haven't purposely integrated into my plans yet, but maybe one day. But so in recreating a forest system, you can really take advantage of a lot of space that in an agricultural commercial system would never really be taken advantage of because things have to be planted and harvested using equipment and machinery. In the very beginning of living in Bayville and planting in that very open, sandy space, I lost a lot of crops. So I did put in some raised beds so that I had some harvest, and I still use those now. This is along between mine and my neighbor's property. And this was the other side of the house in the beginning when I first started planting, and now this is what that side looks like. Here we have some native asters and mountain mint, and this started happening after I started learning about natives. So in 2017, I took the Jersey Yards workshop with home gardeners, and I met Karen and I met Becky LaVoy, and they introduced me to this world of community and conservation and all these local folks and programs that I could learn from and help with. And so I took the Master Naturalist course. And in the Master Naturalist course, there's a lecture, and then there are 6 trips to local parks and the Forest Resource Education Center and places locally that I had never even been to, let alone get a tour with someone who actually could point things out and tell me all about them. I learned so much about native plants and native animals and the ecology and the history of Ocean County during that course. If you haven't taken a Master Naturalist course, I highly recommend it. And in doing that, I learned about native plants and why I should give them a second look, even if they don't produce fruit for me to eat. So I've integrated many of them into my yard. This is the process of building a keyhole garden in my new backyard, and I took some photos to demonstrate that. The raised garden bed with the cutout slice to allow the gardener to access the center of the garden gives you the ability to garden in more space without having to walk on it and compact the soil. This is that compost basket in the center. It's filled with, there's also something in permaculture called hugelkultur. So hugelkultur is basically buried wood. So this would take an awful lot of soil to fill this large garden. So what I did was I found logs, both green and seasoned, just logs from the woods nearby and from our local recycling center. and I fill the bottom of the garden up with logs, because as they decompose over time, this garden's not going anywhere, it's gonna be there for a very long time. As they decompose, what happens to rotten wood as it decomposes? It becomes a sponge, so it absorbs and holds water. You have to irrigate much less if you've buried wood in your garden. So that's the bottom layer of this. It's covered with leaf litter and compost, and then topped with a layer of soil. And then that's in the middle of production. So I've added to this. Now this is what my backyard looks like this season. So I have 2 cedar boxes and 2 keyhole gardens in the backyard. And this is where I plant most of my annual vegetables. This is a project, my brother-in-law is a general contractor, he builds homes. So after a project was done, he had a lot of waste wood. And so Lisa, I'm gonna get rid of this, do you want it? Yeah. Okay. So I used it to create some projects in the yard. This is a kiwi arbor. So these are hardy kiwi. You can grow kiwi in this zone. Kiwi berries are what they're called, hardy kiwi. They're different from the kiwi that you buy in the grocery store, the fuzzy ones. These you can actually eat the skin and everything, and they're kind of the size of a large grape. It takes a while for them to get into production, but once they start producing, they produce heavily, and they grow vigorously, and they need support. So I built this arbor with that waste wood from my brother-in-law. This is called a wattle fence. So at my local recycling center, lots of folks bring their yard waste and dump it. And I go and I root through it for long straight sticks. So they ask, oh, are you building a wreath? Are you making wreaths? No, I'm not. I need a lot of material to make a fence. So I have an auger on a drill, and it's very easy. That's the one good thing about sandy soil. I never need my pickaxe in beta. It's easy to dig. So you can make holes with an auger on the drill and just slide some nice sturdy fence posts in there, 6, and then weave a fence out of them. And that's a little blackberry patch, and I tuck things in between until they fill in. I do have a small greenhouse in my backyard because I like to propagate a lot and start from seed. So this greenhouse has been invaluable. It's less than $400 on Amazon, and it's a 10 by 8 by 10. But I had one that was a 6 by 8 that was like $200. I mean, they're really not that expensive, but it's great to have it if you have the space. And that was more of the waste wood. I made the shelves for the greenhouse. I also have a seed starting, this is my seed collection. I have a seed starting setup that I built from a broken fence panel. And this allows me to raise, you can see the chains, it allows me to raise the lights up and lower them depending on how mature the seedlings are. This is my compost and rain barrel system. So from a Save Barnegat Bay workshop, I created a rain barrel, and I actually had one that was given to me, but I had never hooked up before. When you hook up a rain barrel to a large roof, like your house, you definitely, I just saw that as being super problematic because I would have to deal with a tremendous amount of overflow. And I wasn't sure how to work that in. So instead, I hooked it up to a small roof that I constructed over my compost bays so that I could kind of control the moisture in the compost and collect rainwater at the same time, integrating systems. So here is my rain garden project that I did via the Jersey Yards Home Gardeners Workshop. And this was just the process of digging it out. You can see that it's just so sandy, but it's really gotten great. This was the day I installed it, it poured, and so it worked. And then this is in the beginning of this year, actually, and it's grown in really well. The garden was installed in 2017, 2 years ago. This is the elderberry flowering in the background. And it's my favorite smell of all the flowers that bloom in the yard is elderberry. I can't beat it. So the whole block smells great. It's totally perfect. And then that is it in full bloom. So these are all Jersey friendly and Jersey native plants. This is an American beautyberry. We have coneflower here, balloon flower. This back here is great coneflower, and that just is like gigantic. And then this is aronia, red aronia berry. And red aronia berry are not delicious for humans, but they're nice for birds and the beautiful flowers in the spring. But black aronia berry is potentially delicious. You do have to sweeten it. It makes a terrific jam and jelly and baked kind of thing. But I wouldn't eat the red ones, but they're pretty. And that's the American beautyberry. It's just, they look like bubble gum. They're just fantastic, so ornamental, and yet, you know. So I've been learning a lot about biochar to amend sandy soil. It's a great way to sink carbon and stabilize carbon and nutrients in the soil so it doesn't get washed away, which is what happens with sandy soil very often. So biochar is kind of up and coming when it comes to soil health and what to do about sequestering carbon, but you can get this online, and it's this little biochar kiln, and it's kind of the size of a log that you can put in your fireplace, or you can put it in your fire pit outside. Just if you're gonna make a fire anyway, fill that up with some scrap wood and tuck it in there in the fire and let it go. This reduces the amount of oxygen that can get to that material inside, and it's called pyrolysis. And it burns off all of the unstable material in the carbon, and you're left with very, very stable material that will stay in the soil for thousands of years potentially. So once you have charcoal, which will come out of that little kiln, you can crush it up and put it into compost tea or compost pile, and then when you apply that compost to your yard, those nutrients are locked in right where they need to be in the root zone of the plants, and it won't get washed away, and it releases things slowly. It's a beautiful habitat for soil microorganisms. So that's that. Okay, and then these are, am I too late?
Yeah.
I'm done, yes, okay. Let's see. Let's blow through these really quick. These are just some plants, so you can see the aronia berries. Those are black aronia berries. There's some bee balm there, blackberries, blueberries, elderberries. Those are the elderberry that I picked and made syrup out of. Those are some gooseberries. And highbush cranberry, it's in the viburnum family, just gorgeous. Mayapple, ramps, raspberries, Jerusalem artichoke. And these are the ship gardens, so that's Becky LeBoy, and they're digging holes for fences. We put a lot of mulch out in the ship gardens, and that's what they need because there's no convenient irrigation at Jakes Branch County Park. Ship gardens are the soil health improvement project. They are planted with native plants in 5 gardens around the park, around the plant discovery trail. The different microclimates are a wet garden, a sun garden, a rain garden, and a pollinator garden. Did I get them? Yeah. Okay, so that's the pollinator one. That's the rain garden. It's kind of half mulched. This is the sun garden. A lot of these plants, some of them will make it, some of them won't. Now a lot more are surviving because we're giving them a lot more attention and weeding them and mulching them, but that's basically the volunteer work that I've been doing to maintain my Master Naturalist title and to expand my third of an acre because I only have so much to garden on, and so now I feel like I have a whole park. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very good.